everybody. My name is Pat Wright, as Leah just said. It was 10 years ago when I went to my first ISPS conference, where after desperately looking for sessions, discussing families and finding none, I decided to offer an informal gathering at lunch at the ISPS conference. I'm grateful to have found my tribe, and here I am, all these years later. I'm honored to be a part of this open dialogue panel to offer the basic principles as an introduction for some, a review for others, and an opportunity to meet some excellent trainers. This is the general overview of open dialogue. After lunch, we will be interactive, and you can bring your questions and comments and whatnot. We're looking forward to that. We'll continue introducing ourselves. Ro.
Thank you, Pat. Good to see you. And everyone in the room, thank you for joining us. So yes, my name is Rose Spate. I am a certified New York peer specialist working out of Westchester, New York. I'm also a peer specialist trainer currently, as well as a co-trainer in partnership with Cindy to train on peer-supported open dialogue. I'm also someone who has lived experience within the psychiatric system and also with being psychiatrically labeled. I also have experience of my own family doing social network meetings and experiencing dialogic approaches through Parachute NYC for my own personal use. So it's a very personal experience for me, even though now I'm a trainer. And so when I think about like, what is my history of being on the panel today and what brings me to the panel today, I think it's a really strong and passionate interest in contributing to open dialogue discussions, but from an intersectional peer specialist, and peer supported open dialogue trainer perspective, as well as like a lived experience perspective of psychiatric systems and looking at oppression and how to move forward in these very complicated systems. So definitely looking at social issues, social justice, also how race plays a role in all of this work, and also reconciling the complexities of social and cultural aspects of family identity and expression. What does that really look like? What are the different ways that that shows up? And so I also initially developed a relationship with open dialogue as being the quote identified person of concern in social network meetings. But I also was a daughter, I was a community member, I was a citizen as well. And I think that that's really important to remember. And so I brought all of these social identities into the dialogue. And so I think open dialogue, especially peer-supported open dialogue in particular, aims to have a more holistic view of everyone involved. And I felt like I just said a lot. So I'm going to pass it over to Cindy.
Thank you, Ro. I just want to say, I'm Cindy Peterson-Dana. I'm delighted to be here with all of you today on the panel, in the audience. I want to invite you to, if you haven't already, introduce yourself, chat, share your thoughts amongst yourself. If you have any questions for the panel, we are going to save hopefully the last 10-15 minutes for that. So please just jot them in the Q&A section below. So I live 20 miles north of New York City. I like to say I first came to this work as a young adult when I was hospitalized, for mental health issues. And I got really curious about the way I was treated at that time, some for better, some for not so good. And I went into our field. And so many decades later, I have worked most recently as a dialogic therapist and dialogic trainer, I've worked as a management, for nonprofit management in hospitals. I've always been an advocate for the inclusion of all voices in services, person-centered, recovery-based, rights-based services. But when I discovered open dialogue in about 2010, I saw Dan Mackler's documentary about it. It kind of gave me renewed hope for really bringing all the pieces together. So I've spent the last 12 years trying to understand how it works, getting trained in it, and really trying to work with people around the country and around the world to bring it into services. So I think that's my hope for today, is for us to really have a dialogue about what this approach is and why we think it's important, and how we have and hope to bring it, into practice. I am going to mention that in addition to being a survivor, peer, and a clinician, I also had the experience. I have 4 young adult kids. And about 8.5 years ago, one of my young adults, I just got his permission again this morning to speak about this, at the age of 19, had what we would call an extreme experience. Also, maybe you might call it a first episode of psychosis. And when that happened, I want to say my fear about him going into our treatment as usual services, which at the time would have been the hospital, was greater than my fear, very raw fear about how were we going to get through this. And although I knew about open dialogue and heard about Parachute in New York City at the time, knew a lot of the people that were part of Parachute, we were 20 miles north of the city. So we couldn't call and just have a team do this. But we were able to find a psychiatrist trained in open dialogue and also work with my son's therapist, who was a family therapist, to help us have social network meetings. So it was kind of our attempt to patch the best possible dialogic approach together that we could. And I want to say, I feel like it's been a long journey. I've learned a lot. That's been my greatest teacher, more than the trainings and more than everything else I've done, which also has been a teacher. And it's where my heart is. And it's the biggest reason I'm here today. I tend to think, as Rose said, that I am a citizen, and that we're all family members, and these issues happen in all families. So that's the way I'm looking at our gathering today. And I look forward to hearing from everybody. I'm going to ask Justin if you would like to introduce yourself and share why you're here today.
Thanks, Cindy. Good morning, everyone. And just want to say it's an honor to be with you all today virtually, and with my co-panelists, all of whom I really respect, and just feel very honored to be a part of this group. My name is Justin Palanci. I work as a psychiatrist. I work at Grady Memorial Hospital in Atlanta. And for those of you who don't know, Grady is a safety net hospital that works with a majority of minoritized and marginalized people who face significant psychosocial stressors, including various forms of oppression, marginalization, etc. And my story with open dialogue goes back to 2016, when I was an intern on our inpatient unit. I didn't know anything about open dialogue at the time, but something about doing this work showed me that I needed to, it was imperative that I included families in the process. And that's not something that was routinely being done. But I just had the sense that it was a really important thing to do. Because of that experience and sort of that interest that I showed, I was invited to participate in the first open dialogue training in an effort to bring an open dialogue clinical program to Grady. And through that process, I was able to get connected with the Institute for Dialogic Practice, which is how I met Cindy as one of my colleagues in that training. We did the 3-year training together, and then Ro and Sandy and now Pat. So in my work, so really open dialogue has been essentially a part of my work from the beginning, and resonates and aligns with my values as a clinician, as a human being, and has opened up ways for me to work with people and their families in a way that I think has been, at the very least, as less harmful as possible, and hopefully helpful some of the time as well. And yeah, I'm excited to be a part of this panel to talk about ways forward with open dialogue, opportunities and challenges that we've faced in doing this kind of work. And yeah, so I look forward to it. I'll pass it over to Sandy now.
Okay. Everybody, thank you so much for being here. I'm going to start as I talk to share my desktop because I'm going to be giving a talk in a minute. But basically, my name's Sandy Steingard. I'm a psychiatrist. I've worked, I've been involved with psychiatry for a really long time, since, let's say, the late 70s, early 80s, according to what you count. And I have had a long interest in the experience that we call psychosis. And I've been involved in the public sector for many years. I'm currently I live in Vermont. I worked in Burlington, Vermont, Chittenden County, Vermont, Vermont is a very small state, but this is the population center for the state, and worked at a community mental health center. My clinical work was always with the people who in another era would have been in institutions, people, many of them experiencing extreme states or psychosis. So that's been my interest. And I think in a lot of ways, up until about 10, 12 years ago, I was a pretty standard psychiatrist, with the one caveat that for a long time, I was pretty appalled at the commercialization of medicine and the influence of pharmaceutical companies. But my connection to open dialogue began with Robert Whitaker's book, Anatomy of an Epidemic, which raised a lot of important questions. I was among a multitude of people who learned about open dialogue from that book. And I was in such a state about what to do, with my career. And I've been very, very lucky to have the opportunity to study and travel and meet a lot of the people. I also was at the Institute for Dialogic Practice, and I've been to Tornio and Tromsø and, met a lot of people. And then again, with a lot of luck and some perseverance among many of my colleagues, we've started an adaptation of open dialogue in Vermont that we call collaborative network approach. So that's me. My role here, I guess I'll start my timer right now because I don't want to go on too long. But I'm going to give kind of an overview for those of you who are not familiar with this. So this will be kind of a brief level. I'm going to talk about need-adapted treatment, which is really the forerunner to open dialogue, and then open dialogue. So basically, this evolved in the 80s, and in Finland, as in the United States at the time, and a lot of the Western world, people were moving for a whole variety of reasons to deinstitutionalization, closing down the large mental hospitals. And Dr. Alonen, a psychiatrist in northern Finland, and his colleagues at the time recognized that there were a lot of different ways to think about psychosis, and they all had their own treatment, and some treatment seemed to work for some people and not for other people. And I'd say in the 80s, even in the United States, things were more open. There was a more, the biological model was reaching, a lot of strength in that time. But there were still sort of, psychological models, family systems, social psychiatry, I'd say, was always a bigger thing in Europe than here. And what they did was to bring the person at the center of concern in the family into a room and share this dilemma, And what was interesting is that they found that those meetings in and of themselves seemed to be helpful. So they became very curious about what was happening in that meeting. And they developed what's called need-adapted treatment with attitude. It's an attitude. It's an attitude that acknowledged the potential value of different paradigms. It's flexible, democratic, less hierarchical. And I'm going to be sort of saying this a lot, in the next 10 minutes or so. But the idea is there is no one person or profession or paradigm that holds the authority, the epistemic authority, the knowledge source. And it's not like you have to give up. Like for me, I I don't have to give up the parts of me that hold on to sort of the medical model paradigm or biological paradigms. I just need to be willing to accept that it may not be the truth. And it may be one way of thinking about the situation, but not the only way. And that I need to be very receptive and deeply, not putting on an act, but deeply respectful of every other view, including the person who may have been identified as having an idea that's idiosyncratic and maybe not based in conceptual reality, what I might call a delusion. And you still approach that a person with respect and valuing their perspective. It's this flexible, democratic, less hierarchical. I'd say in the medical model, there's an evaluative process that leads to a diagnosis. Even it might be a differential diagnosis. It may be a guess, but still that diagnosis then would drive the treatment. And I would argue that that's true in a lot of psychological treatments. Let's say that use formulation. The formulation is still used. It still can be imposed on the individual, and it drives the treatment. And need adaptive treatment, you're very slow to make diagnosis or even formulation. And the needs of the patient and system drives the plan. It's really an opening up as opposed to kind of a closing down, which I think a lot of standard treatments do. I wanted a hotbed of this work happen because I think it had something to do with it. So right up here, this is Norway, Sweden, and then it's not in red, but that's Finland. So it's way up, like practically on top of the world. And then even within those countries, so here's Finland, this is Tornio, and that's the home of open dialogue. And this is Tromsø, Norway. And there was a psychiatrist, Tom Anderson, who worked with the team, and they really kind of, they smashed down figuratively the one-way mirror of systemic family therapy. Instead of having therapists in another room who would talk through a microphone to the therapist in the room, they came in the room and talked openly with people. And there was a lot of synergism between their work and Tornio. Now, these are very sophisticated countries. And, Tromsø is known as like the northernmost university in the world, as a medical school and everything. But on the other hand, like they were far from their population centers. And I think that gave them some ability to explore this. Now, what happened in Finland is that they began to study this. They had 6 regions. Their first study was in the late 80s, early 90s, and they studied it in 3 regions. But in 3 of the regions, they decided to hold off on using antipsychotic drugs. Now, I'm not going to get into the drug stuff. I mean, it's a big interest of mine, and we can get into it with questions if we want. But at that time, it was not considered, received wisdom that antipsychotics needed to be started early. That's a whole interesting story that in our country, but it was more of a question, and they were interested in holding off. So in 3 regions, they tried not to give antipsychotics for the first 6 weeks. And in Tornio, they continued to do this work, and it evolved into what they called open dialogue. So it was both this way of being, and I'm going to talk about what it was, but also this holding off of meds. And a lot of us got interested because of this data. Now, they went and did that original 5-year study and 2 other studies where they did long-term outcomes. There's now some 20-year outcomes that are very interesting. But this is what I first saw that got my interest. And what's fascinating here is that at 5 years, in the Tornio group, 19% are in disability compared to a matched group from Stockholm that got like an innovative first episode psychosis study, but their use of medications, it wasn't open dialogue, was pretty standard. And there you have 62% on disability. And you can just see in these highlighted numbers how few people were ever put on antipsychotic drugs. So this got my attention. I got a lot of people's attention, and but it led me to study this. And I've learned that there's a richness to the practice of open dialogue that goes well beyond how they use the medications. However, I think they're both really, really important. So what is it? It's helped me to think about it as 2 parts: the organization of a mental health care system and a particular form of therapeutic interaction called dialogic practice. You can offer dialogic practice independent of the whole systemic change. In fact, I don't think there's I think it's very, very hard to do the whole thing. And there's kind of a debate within, the field of like, well, is that okay? Or what parts can be taken? I tend to be I'm my like a personal motto, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And I'm big on saying, there are parts of this that are good. Let's try it out if we can. And again, if this comes up in questions, we can talk about it. But they define these 7 principles, which I'm separating them out into systemic and dialogic practice. So the principles are immediate help, network orientation, flexibility and mobility, responsibility, and psychological continuity. And again, I have another couple slides that go over this, but let me just talk about it in concrete language. There's a number. In Tornio, if you have a concern, it's not just about psychosis. This is how their mental health system is organized. A family member has a concern, you call this number. And in addition to hearing why you're calling, what the problem is, their next question is, who would be helpful to understand this problem? And within 24 to 48 hours, they have a team. They work in pairs who meets with this network. They bring these people together wherever it is best for that network to meet, in the home, in the schools. And then this idea of responsibility of psychological continuity, as you heard in the intro, this is considered a crisis program. They're not thinking that they're getting people that are going to be chronic mental patients. They're thinking that a lot of these problems will resolve. And so they approach it in a crisis way, but the team that starts takes the responsibility of organizing, working with them, and continuing with them through the crisis. So in the dialogic practice part is this toleration of uncertainty. That goes back to saying, we don't know, and keeping the conversation open as opposed to closing it down. And dialogic practice, I'm going to explain a little bit more about what that means. So this is from a paper that was written by Mary Olson, Jakob Sekala, and Doug Ziodonis, who, as interest was heating up about this and people wanted to study it, you needed to define it. So they needed to develop fidelity measures. So Justin was part of a project with these same people where they actually applied this and use those fidelity measures. But this paper is open access, and I find it to be a really simple, very accessible, both you can get it for free, and just the language of it to explain what open dialogue is. So some of this I've said. They work in teams. They involve the family or the social network. This gets at the dialogic practice. They start meetings with what's the history of the meeting, and everyone in the room is invited to answer that. And then you say, how would you like to use this meeting? Everyone in the room is invited to answer that. And that second question is how you start subsequent meetings. You're very much responding to the local language, the person's utterances. So you really want to check yourself to use your language. So I would hold off on using psychosis or auditory hallucinations or even voices or delusions. I would really listen to what the person's saying and use those languages. Now, down the road, there could be a reason to bring that in, but early on, you're really focusing on their language. You're in the present moment. Polyphony, you're bringing in multiple voices, both the inner and outer voice, and as a facilitator or a therapist or whatever you call yourself, you would do that yourself, and you might bring in some of your own inner voice, but you're also going to engage absent members. What would your father say if he were here? What would, someone talks about a family member who has died. Sometimes these people are very, very important in the family system and language, and you might bring them in. This relational focus is very much a part of the dialogic practice. Who would, and circular questions is a way to get at that. Who agrees with this? Who doesn't agree? Who thought it was a good idea to come? Who didn't want to come? So this is the way you're engaging with people. And then responding to discourse is meaningful. So to maybe characterize a medical model, you might say, this is, these delusions are part of your brain, isn't working right. This isn't real. The voices aren't real. In this way of working, you have a lot of curiosity about what these experiences are. And you may want to tie them into other people's experiences. And that can be very powerful, even if someone else in the family hasn't exactly heard voices. I mean, a lot of us have some perceptual distortion at some point, and I think this audience probably knows how terribly isolating the experience of psychosis can be. And when people say, you have this idea that no one else in the world thinks, it's so lonely. And so trying to like bring that into, the rest of the world and the family. And again, I think I just have 2 more slides and then I'm going to stop talking. I'm just emphasizing qualities of the practice: being present, slowing down. Everyone has voice, everyone has expertise. A lot of this I've said, you listen more than talking. Reflecting rather than interpreting is like a really big statement, hard to say. And I've learned in myself and working with other people that even if you don't think you're interpreting, I think it's endemic in the way we're trained to work. John is angry because of, and you, in this way of working, you really want to say, boy, I felt this burning in me when you talk like that, and just reflect the feeling. And don't, even if John hasn't said they're angry, go, why do you think John's angry? Listen to yourself and maybe say something that kind of reflects on what your feelings are. It's very much in the here and now. And one really lovely thing, and like, there's no reason we can't do this. It's like they took lessons in hospitality. I mean, it's very much about appreciation, invitation. One way for me to just try to get myself in a reflecting mode is to say, I'm wondering, and not to say it to the person. So even if you talk about anger, I'm wondering if anyone else is feeling this anger. It just goes out into the ether, not saying directly to the person, I think you're angry, which can really shut things down. And again, this is the final slide, I think. Yep, it is. So you may not be, I can't see the top of this on my screen, but it's open dialogue is on my left and standard care. So a lot of this I've talked about, that open dialogue has, you follow people through. In our current system, if you have a crisis, you may talk to many, many people before you land with someone who's going to work with you. Very much focused on the social network. I mean, I can't tell you how many times in my office a family member calls, they're in crisis, and they bring John to the office and sit in the car outside while I fix John. And I've had to really work to say, why don't you come in? I'd love to hear what you have to say. You're so important to John's life. It's sort of obvious, and yet it isn't. It's become less obvious to people. In the standard system, there's often a pre-existing menu of services that we then plug the person into, whereas this approach, as I said, is flexible and mobility. And it's not that you can't use drugs or can't use CBT or can't use supported employment. All of that I think of this as a hub and spoke, and that the dialogic meetings are this hub, and all these other things can come into it. But it might be like, I'm wondering if John has thought about working. Like, who thinks it would be a good idea for John to work? Who thinks it wouldn't be? And then you might invite in your employment person. So that's, you don't have to give this up. It's sort of how you introduce this. The toleration of uncertainty I talked about, and in the core system now, most of the time, often, let me say, when families are brought in, it's in psychoeducation. We're going to tell you what the diagnosis is and teach you how to help John. And this is a shift from that. And then I really like to emphasize agency and voice. I mean, agency is a really important part for people to sort of get up and go and get moving. And a lot of what we do, I think, gives a message of a person being a passive vehicle, a recipient of our administrations, whatever it is we're doing, often with drugs. Like, I need the drugs and then I'll go on. And I think that you want to try to tone down. In this way of working, the person is not so much the object of what you're doing. They're really very much a part of it. So I will stop, and I'll stop sharing, and I'll just turn it back over to my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandy. Rose, should we take a minute and reflect?
Yes, absolutely.
So
Go ahead.
I'm just going to say I was kind of moved by so much of what Sandy shared, even though I've heard this before. Every time I hear it, I kind of think of new things. And I'm thinking of agency and voice. And again, I'm coming back to the question of kind of what happens in our treatment system as usual, and how this is different from the very beginning, and how that may impact the person and their social network.
Yes, I mean, again, like you, Cindy, a lot of rich history. And what strikes me is kind of like this contrast, and maybe this is a little bit abstract, but I was really struck by like the homogeneousness of it coming from Finland, and kind of like this point of polyphony, right? That there's multiple voices, that there's multiple perspectives, that there's multiple understandings. And so I was really, really struck by this kind of like dichotomy of Sandy presenting the history, but also having this balance of like an openness to multiplicity. And how does that play out for different families, for different individuals? And for me specifically, it struck me as someone who has a lived experience with voice hearing. How does that play into a person's understanding of the experience? And not having that be a singular understanding. So really looking at polyphony and multiplicity and how that's being held in this context in dialogic approaches.
Yeah, from the very beginning, there's many voices. So I know there's many voices on our panel today, and I wanted to take a few minutes and ask all of the panelists to share, what they're doing currently, what they've done to bring dialogic approaches to their context.
I could share a bit, although I'm wondering if Pat, please go ahead.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I had got involved in a group. There was a research conference on open dialogue about a year and a half ago or so. And that's how I got involved with, we created global families for dialogic approaches. So we have people that meet globally. So we have to set the time. For me, it's 7:30 in the morning, but we have people in Australia and whatnot. And it's just helpful to hear there are people that are really wanting to bring this, I'm going to call it a framework, to where we are, where they are, and, up against everything that we know is out there. We've been talking about that at this conference and all the challenges and obstacles in that. So being able to talk with people throughout the globe and also have this empathy for, we're all going through very similar things in these different parts of the world. And there's kind of a, kind of like we're not isolated at all. We're all kind of wanting the same thing for our family members, our people, to be treated humanely, compassionately, to be listened to. I like what Sandy said about it's basic hospitality. Yeah, thanks. Justin, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Pat. And I was sort of, sort of the line that Sandy shared that keeps coming back to me is don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. And I think that in some ways might summarize our experience with the Open Dialogue Atlanta program that I referenced briefly in my opening remarks. So this was a clinical and research program where we were, hoping to implement this approach with using an organizational change model and having a briefer training period than sort of the 2 or 3 year trainings that are normally done in the approach. And it really required a culture shift in sort of how we approach the people that we're working with, and how do we go about inviting families in, right? And how do we even change things like our intake process, right? Like how do we shift the intake process from a series of checkboxes to really a conversation, a dialogue around what is bringing, what the history of the meeting is, and what is bringing this person and their network into Meet. So, that program, we implemented aspects of, as Sandy referenced, sort of as many of the systemic aspects of the approach as we could, trying to provide immediate help when someone was in crisis, providing psychological continuity and flexibility. But we were still sort of a system within a larger system, and still having to navigate sort of the constraints of that system. That project then sort of adapted into how do we implement these ideas and this work in a more in a broader way, and so we're doing that now both through our first episode program, our coordinated specialty care program, and then the program that I'm the medical director for, our assertive community treatment program. And for me, it's been about embracing the values of open dialogue around meaning making in the course of dialogue, and inviting in the social, inviting in the family perspective or other social supports into the discussions, and working from there, and sort of slowly bringing in my colleagues and teammates into sort of working more in this way. And it's an ongoing process, and I'd be happy to share more about sort of how the successes and challenges, but I'll that's what I'll say for now.
Thank you, Justin. Ro, do you want to share a bit?
Do you want to reflect or just?
Well, I know that you and I have worked to bring this into several contexts, and I feel like we've learned a lot. There's been a lot of promise, and I think a lot of hope, and then also some frustration. So I'm really here with uncertainty today about, excitement, I'm going to say, about this way of working. And, 8.5 years after using it as a family, on the bright side, I would say my son has, not needed to be hospitalized, and minimal use of prescribed drugs, mostly for sleep, and maybe extreme periods of anxiety for just, maybe a week or two. So there's definitely been a different way of working with medication using dialogic approaches. I think we got the message from the beginning that this was a family relational kind of concern. And so we've been included all along. And so I think at this point, we really don't use a lot of professional support. And, that's been interesting to me, just how families kind of realize they do have a lot of resources, and they're really empowered individuals and families to find those and use those. Much more peer support, much less professional support. That said, I was kind of shocked how hard it's been to really find a group of professionals, peer professionals, psychiatrists, therapists working in this way, where we could get something similar to what's been developed, I know, in the UK and also Finland, and where there's actually, this is treatment as usual in some areas. So my biggest hope at the moment is a training that Ro and I have done 3 times with an agency here in the Hudson Valley, that is really trying to bring this approach into all their services, all their clinical services, especially crisis services. And so we've been using Zoom for the trainings. I'm just kind of amazed I was very concerned about Zoom. I still think it has its limits, but it's really allowed us to offer trainings and also social network meetings much more easily. They're much more accessible to more people who probably couldn't take a break in their workday to come to a meeting as often. But I just feel like our work's cut out for us. I just continue to just deeply appreciate this way of working, and feel like there's a lot to talk about going forward for those of us that are interested.
I definitely agree, Cindy. And I will just add that one of the things, especially, thinking about this diaspora of open dialogue's reach, is when it reached Harlem, which was where I received support from Parachute. What struck me the most about being in a social network meeting was that it was such a kind of almost radical invitation to confront family, not only as a unit or as a collective, but also all of the multiplicity of the individuals in the family. And really being okay with sitting with some very difficult and challenging feelings, and being able to not run away from them, not pathologize them, and to really hold integrity in pain. So that's what really struck me from my own lived experience. And then again, with you, Cindy, I share this wondering and pondering of how can this approach be more accessible? And what does that really mean by making this approach more accessible? And so I think that leads us into our next question of what would be kind of a good, like, what's next, or what are your thoughts about what would be a good outcome, or what's next for open dialogue? Your personal thoughts about it.
So I'm asking everybody, whoever wants to jump in.
I can go next. While we did not, as a family, receive open dialogue, 2009, when my son was hospitalized and diagnosed. But fortunately, because I had been a disability advocate for myself, I was able to rely on the network that I already had for support and learn how to build a network for him, of course, of his choosing. And he wasn't choosing at the time. But he did get an ACT team pretty shortly after he got out of the hospital. And I'm from Minnesota, by the way. And that was helpful after the first couple case managers that weren't necessarily helpful. But then he's had the same counselor for, well, what's it been, over 10 years. And she has been able to be very dialogic with him in a way that is, incredible in terms of other quote unquote professionals that I have known, and I've known a lot over the years through my family of origin. And so that has been very impressive to me, that she has been able to be with him. He can be on the verge of going to the hospital, and he can sit down and have a conversation with her about why would he go, why doesn't he want to go, and they can be in that conversation for several days. And as a parent, to have an adult son in this case that is literally, and I don't want to put words on it, but let's just say in extreme states, and he tells me I can talk about him if it's going to help other people, and I assume this is going to help other people, hopefully. So still, as a single parent that, didn't know what to do, was wanting to take care of myself, to have another person that I trusted, that he trusted, could sort through what was going on with him. I remember one time, he's been living independent for several years, but when things fall apart, he usually comes home. And I remember one summer, it was a couple of years ago, and it was really hot out, and he was sitting out in the yard on a swing. And And I was talking to somebody, actually, it was a speaker that was going to speak here. And I remember saying to her, well, there he is out there on the swing, and it's like nothing's going on, day in and day out. And she said to me, well, there could be a spiritual crisis going on. And I thought about that, and I thought, wow, yeah, what do I know? Like, definitely. I don't want to make assumptions about what's going on with him. And I need people around me to remind me, just like being here, that I, as a parent, don't necessarily know what's going on with him. And that's been an incredible learning process, and it continues. It's very humbling, let me say that, especially because I was a parent educator for several years and thought I knew a few things. But it's a personal growth journey also. And today he's been doing wonderfully for 2.5 years. He has a car. He's been working for a couple years. He comes over all the time. He helps me make bread together, and we juice together. And he just put a grill together that I just got. And, it just kind of amazes me how, the skills that he has and the things that he can do. And I try and really enhance those because then he feels good about himself. And of course I do too. So yes, I think it's very important, and I'm hoping that we see more open dialogue opportunities. And that's what we've all been talking about, the last couple days, is how can we do things differently in the quote unquote mental health field. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. And I just want to take a moment to recognize ISPS-US as making a very intentional effort in the last 10, 15, 20 years to include experts by experience in conferences, leadership. I feel like that's something we can all do to kind of continue to invite voices into positions of power and influence. I think we got a lot of work to do just to kind of develop a process so that we stay dialogical ourselves as we're trying to develop this approach for families. Right now in this country, training is very important to be able to work this way, and then ongoing support, intervision for people working in this way. And it tends to be pretty expensive, and there's a real limited amount of spots available. So one thought I have is that we need to figure out ways to really expand that. And I have an idea that ISPS may have an interest in helping us do that. So I would love to be a part of that effort, and curious if others would like to be a part. The last thing I want to say is that I really think on the very deepest level, the dialogic approach has the potential. I don't think we always live up to it, but I think it really has the potential to address things like epistemic injustice, the othering and colonizing that we talk about, all the human rights issues that we've referred to about who gets to define who puts themselves or ends up in positions of power, our meritocracy. And it doesn't mean to diminish. I don't mean when I say that to diminish any of our education and expertise. On the other hand, the power issue is almost always there. And I just think that needs to stay in the dialogue. So those would be my hopes. Sandy, do you have thoughts about next steps?
I don't have, as I mentioned, we're working to develop something in Vermont. I'm very, my focus has been on making this accessible and affordable. One of the questions was, isn't this expensive? And it is, although if you look at it from the big picture, if we're able to reduce people becoming chronic or on disability, that in the larger picture, it should save money. But nevertheless, budgets are made on what you have to spend now. So, we tried to make it accessible. I mean, I'm in a funny position because I'm, partially retired, whatever. So I'm working with them, but not as much. But it's in general, I don't know that much on it. I will say I'm monitoring the Q&A, and there are a lot of questions as well. So if at any point I could kind of share, offer some of those. I've been answering some, but not all of them. And also my answer is just one answer. So
Yeah, it sounds great. Is that good
I mean,
with everybody?
okay. I mean, one thing I'll just start off with is we've heard some personal experiences about family members, and I don't know if anyone wants to share like a personal experience of having been the person who's center of concern and participating in this way of working. That was one of the questions.
Yeah, I think I definitely saw that. I think that's really pivotal. What I will say will probably sound really harsh, but I'm going to be very brutally honest, because it is a part of, I think, this breaking open that happens in a dialogic process. So when I was, quote, the person of concern in a social network meeting with my loved one, it was difficult. It was uncomfortable. We were in a place of a lot of tension, a lot of separation and misunderstanding and disconnection. So when we were placed in a room together or an environment together, there was all of these different feelings that I had never uttered or expressed or articulated to my loved one. And I was actually quite afraid in my first social network meeting. I was like, oh my goodness, how am I going to confront this and hold space with someone that I'm feeling a lot of resentment and anger and displaced feelings with? Like, how is that going to work? But what happened is that those tensions were able to arise. I was able to speak my ambivalence in the room, and then lo and behold, my loved one was able to speak their, unease and discomfort of being in the room and not knowing what the other was thinking. And so just airing out our discomfort and our uncertainty alleviated that initial ambivalence, and then it kind of broke open this atmosphere where we both could kind of, not in the first meeting, but have that initial kind of like, well, maybe this could be helpful. Maybe this could be a context where I can express and articulate things and then have them heard with the facilitators of the meeting, and so I know that also might sound very technical, but it basically was a challenge to then break through to a new opportunity for all of us to come together and have understanding, even if we couldn't do it directly with one another right away. So that's some of what my personal lived experience was with social network meetings. But what it did is it planted a seed that never left. And from meeting to meeting, it continued to blossom. And I want to turn it over to other people.
Yeah, thank you. We're going to go ahead. I'll just interrupt here for a minute. There are audience questions and there are chat questions. So maybe I think what we're doing is alternating. So maybe we can have an audience person and then come back to you, Sandy. Okay, thanks. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you all so much for sharing your wisdom in this talk. It's been really interesting to listen to. I'm here from a number of perspectives. One is as a family member. My mom has bipolar disorder, has experienced psychosis in different states. She also lives well in recovery, but kind of seen this from the family side. And it's just immediately obvious hearing this, like how valuable it is to families and how just sort of like obviously this should be the approach when someone has a crisis, because there's many voices and perspectives. And there are times when I feel like my family's kind of like invented this, like we all need to get in a room and talk about this. I'm also coming at this from a perspective of creating products and tech products, and we're currently creating a business around family support in mental illness. And the other thing that strikes me is obvious about open dialogue is how logistically like difficult the principles are, right? Immediate support and continuity and multiple voices. You're just kind of running into the laws of physics to get that going. And I am interested in how technology might help with that. Someone talked a little bit about that. I'd also just like to invite anyone that wants to talk about how technology could help with that to come talk to me after. But I'm curious what the panels have experience with that. Particularly, I'm sure in the pandemic, there's been a lot of experimentation with that as well. Sorry for the long question, but I guess it's specifically about the logistics and if you've had experiences with virtual delivery.
Sure.
Thank you. Can I just make sure that the virtual people can hear the question that was just asked in the room? Okay, great. Thank you. Sorry. Okay, take
Great.
it away. Take it away.
Andy, I'm
Up to you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I could answer. I mean, I think my first thought is, I think over the last 2.5 years, we've all had to learn how to pivot to working virtually with folks. I do have to say that for me, it's really, I get a lot of value from being in the room with folks. And I'm feeling that today too. I wish I was in the room with you all actually, but I think that there have been ways to work virtually in this approach, and it does help when someone, in terms of the logistics of gathering a social network that might be dispersed in a city or even across the country, and having people join and being able to participate and to see and hear folks, that has been helpful. And I've had very productive network meetings in that context. So I guess from that standpoint, I think it is certain. I don't know if my answer is too micro, but I definitely think it's possible to work virtually in this way. And then and I'll say also in terms of program development, et cetera, trainings and intervision and all of those other things, I think can also be done successfully in a virtual setting.
I mean, I think part of your question was the logistics, and the logistics of this can be overwhelming, and it still is where I'm working, and but it's so, for people to be able to Zoom in is easy. Families aren't always even in the same town, or people are busy. And I remember pre-COVID doing one meeting with someone, and the parents were in another state and they were on the phone, and that felt I remember at the time, it felt like really exotic and all. And I used to do Skype supervision with a couple in Finland at my agency, which like even getting it to set up was some like major thing to go through the firewall of the agency. And now it's so easy. So I do think there's an aspect of it that is easy, even in in May of 2020, when things were so chaotic. I mean, I've never, as with many other people, for me with work, it was just kind of really pushing me to my limit. And I worked with this young man and his mother having a first episode, and we were like, they'd be in their car on her phone, and we'd have these meetings. Unfortunately, he came out of it, but it was great because, in another era, he could have been in the hospital and labeled, and a lot of the work was saying, sometimes people get a little out there. It doesn't mean this is it. A lot of it is it's a kind of it's like reverse psychoeducation. But So I don't know. I mean, because I'm not working as intensively as the rest of you, I say all this lightly because maybe I would be finding it awful. But I think it's opened up some ease in some circumstances.
Thank you, Sandy. Was there a question from the online audience?
Well, I'm going to pick from these because they're themes. So, and I think just in terms of time, two major themes, and I'll tell you what they are, but maybe we can do the first one. And it's a lot about what about toxic families, difficult families, both how do you handle it in the room and what do you do, or when, how do you define a family, or what if a person doesn't have a family? I think that's like a set of questions we approach a lot. And then the other ones have to do with either access to treatment or training. Again, these are common things, and maybe we'll come back to them this afternoon, but I'll put those to the panelists. Those are ones I did not choose to answer because they're such big questions.
Those are big questions that I remember coming up a lot during our training. And then part of what we try to do after training when we're practicing this way is to have some type of group supervision. We call it intervision. That's the model they're using in the UK. So really, literally week to week, kind of navigating through each social network, in the sense that this is voluntary. So we would never want to force people to be in the presence of members that they didn't want to meet with. But it doesn't mean we can't start where we start with kind of whoever's, kind of most concerned, be open to meeting with, and then maybe go from there. And I think the other part of this approach is to realize, we have this person at the center of concern that tends to be who everybody's focused on at the beginning. But that often in a family, there's many people who are distressed or having difficult things going on. And so one approach can be just to maybe have smaller meetings with smaller groups of people that include, somebody who maybe is felt to be toxic by other people, and then see how it evolves. So, that's one response I have. The other one regarding just the Zoom meetings, and I'm not sure I got to this earlier, but really making sure if you're in a Zoom meeting, and this could include making sure everybody has a voice, the people have their own devices if they choose to. So, so part of the facilitator's job is really to make sure and keep it a safe enough space for a dialogue and to intervene if there's ways we need to shift just any particular moment that's, becoming what feels like unsafe. And this is all part of supervision and training. So it's great questions. And I feel like it is why we need more spaces to support each other doing this work.
Yeah, and one thing I would add is that, at least for me, as I've grown to understand, especially peer-supported open dialogue, is that dialogue and the polyphony is more expansive. For me, I interpret it to mean the environment, the community. That's all a part of the polyphony at play into someone's experience, that it's not just necessarily isolated to the family context, even though historically it has. But I think when you factor in social and cultural constructs and how they're having dialogue with the family and with individuals who are part of these dialogues, it just broadens the context so much. So I definitely appreciate kind of like the commentary about, well, what do you do as far as like when there's a sense of violence, or how do you navigate individuals who might not be able to access the meeting. It really is about bringing all of the voices into the context that can't be present. So if someone's going to be in danger because of someone, maybe that person can't be in the physical virtual room or physical room, but we can bring in the voice of that person into the dialogue. and we can bring in the voice of socioeconomic dynamics. That's something that has been very much on my mind lately. So.
And I just wanted to add a couple things if I could. I know there are many questions, but one is I hear this a lot, and I actually every quarter I speak to our first year interns on the inpatient unit, and oftentimes people say, well, what if we can't identify a family or we can't identify a support person? And I talk about family meetings, not necessarily capital O, capital D, open dialogue. And I say my experience has been and was that with just a little bit of effort, you can often identify a social support for someone. And that because the way our system sort of removes the individual and sort of communicates and puts all the emphasis on the individual, we're silencing those voices and we're separating those connections. And so it's really, my experience has been, it's been the exception, not the rule, that it's a sort of finding a support person or and certainly a loved one for the folks working with. And then in terms of the toxic family member, I just wanted to say that my approach, obviously in situations of abuse, things like that there are certain situations that are obviously a no-go. But in terms of sort of maybe the toxic family member or the challenging family member, I really try to approach that from a feeling of I have to appreciate and value the person for showing up, because there are many other family members who often don't show up, and then I also really try to approach it, that their behavior or their communication style, et cetera, from a stance of understanding. I'm not necessarily saying the person at the center of concern has to see it in that way, but my approach is trying to understand why someone is communicating or behaving in a certain way, and oftentimes it has to do with a sense of defensiveness because they have not been involved in the past and they just want to be involved in this process, right? They care about their loved one. Maybe they're not showing it in the healthiest way or the best way. Not for me to decide, but it's really about understanding where that comes from.
Thank you, Justin. And I know this is going to be a huge disappointment to folks, but we are out of time. However, I want to remind you that this panel is meeting again. Is it at 1:00 today? You're continuing this conversation. So we have lots of questions from the online audience and in persons that were not answered. Perhaps going to that session would be a way for you to continue these thoughts that you have. So thank you so much for coming. We will continue at 1:00.